So, let's have a little chat about the response I received to a previous video of mine and a bit of information I uncovered the other day. A few weeks back, I uploaded a video titled, "Your Opinion is Wrong, Sargon and Anita at VidCon," and this was met with a very mixed response. I gave my own evaluation of the interactions between Anita, Sargon, and the VidCon staff, and had some criticisms for Sargon because of how he handled the event. Mainly that Sargon shot himself in the foot by assuming bias where there was no evidence that any existed. Now, there were a lot of people who agreed with me on this one, but as you can see, my detractors definitely made their voices heard, which I greatly appreciate. Out of the 140 or so comments, I generally received the same few criticisms from the people who criticized me. The one that we'll be focusing on was that VidCon, or more specifically Hank Green, didn't actually reprimand Anita for her actions, and that this totally shows bias on their part. This is one where I kind of got the feeling that some people were being a little bit silly and didn't like me using the word reprimand in this context, but to those folks there isn't really much I can do for them. But for others on this side of things, I think it would be worthwhile to go back through what was in VidCon's public statement very quickly to explain my reasoning. So, we'll start about halfway down the Who's Harassing Whom section, which, by the way, is a very indicative title that carries an implication with it. I'll leave it to you to figure out what that implies. This year, we had a contingent of attendees, some who paid, some who snuck in with fake passes, who had been either perpetrators of this harassment or had, for years, watched as the outrage they cultivated resulted in followers doxing, harassing, intimidating, and even threatening the lives of the creators on these panels. Now, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I did just want to go over that part very quickly because it had been a source of confusion as well. In this paragraph, the person who wrote this is looking at the anti-SJW community as part of, or the same as, the general commentary community, of which there were some prominent YouTubers who, for some reason, snuck in with fake passes, despite almost certainly having the money to pay for actual passes. Needless to say, them seeing it that way is incorrect. But I can understand the confusion because it does happen that we'll both cover the same issues from time to time. But to the best of my knowledge, no one from the anti-SJW community snuck in with fake passes. They go on in the next paragraph to say that the group of shitlords at Anita's panel should have been aware that them sitting front and center would have been intimidating for the panelists, and that the panelists were on edge throughout the discussion. This statement only makes sense if you replaced the panelists with Anita Sarkeesian. No one else on the panel seemed to notice that this group of shitlords was there until Anita made a big deal about it. And even then, she seemed to be really the only person who cared, or at least the only one who cared to any significant degree. The next paragraph here and the bit that follows it are the most telling pieces of this statement. During the panel, a panelist called out one of the audience members for being someone who has made her life very difficult, and wished she didn't have to give him attention because he was a garbage human. Now, we could go on about that part alone, but I am sure that we all know how wrong it is. They then say that even though they understand that the comment exists in a broader and pretty messed up context, they still don't want their panelists to insult audience members, and that they had these rules in place for a good reason. It's also explained here that Hank Green said the same thing to Anita in private, as well as having apologized to her for not having been more aware of the situation before this panel took place. This is all corporate speak, and the actions one can take away from this are completely down to how you interpret it. However, the one thing that is explicitly stated here is that Anita was reprimanded for violating VidCon's policies. Now, I have to ask this question just for the people who I'm sure won't accept that as an answer. Let's assume for a second that Hank Green went into a private conversation with Anita and gave her the verbal equivalent of a schoolyard beatdown. Assuming that happened, would you expect VidCon to give a public statement any different from this one? If you're someone who's savvy to this kind of thing, then no, you wouldn't. Keeping that in mind, I'm going to have to say that the most likely reason people have interpreted this in the least charitable way is that people are still making assumptions about VidCon or Hank Green that they shouldn't be. This was the entire point of my video. Sargon and lots of other people made assumptions that they shouldn't have, because when you assume things about people, you will never give anyone a fair assessment. Explaining this in more detail doesn't really prove anything though. It's essentially me just doubling down on what I said, and that isn't the reason we're here for this video. I said earlier that I uncovered a bit of information to share with you guys, remember? As it turns out, about a year ago, Hank Green released a public statement on his Tumblr account explaining exactly what he thought of the anti-SJW community here on YouTube. It has since been deleted, but not before Google had a chance to archive it. On September 19th, 2016, Polka Dot Socks asked, "What's your take on, for lack of a better term, anti-SJW reactions? I mean, what do you think drives it? What do you think is the broader political or social character of the people that express that sentiment? And what do you think the response to the people that express that sentiment should be?" Hank Green responded, "Here's what I think. These ideas about how words have deep and sometimes hidden impacts on people, they developed in isolation at academic institutions. They sat around in the collective consciousness of liberal arts educated folks like myself for a long time before finally leaking out as the internet brought overeducated people together with people who had never been exposed to these ideas. When that started happening, it mostly resulted in harmless frustration as people who were 10 steps deep into these issues expressed frustration at people who were busy living lives that did not include feminist critique, and vice versa. But the internet doesn't amplify harmless frustration. It amplifies the voices of the most outraged. And the outrage pulls useless, angry, poorly reasoned arguments out of both sides. Then one side shares the worst of the responses from the other side, and the other side responds in kind. The anti-SJW side never actually got exposed to the original arguments. They were either exposed to the worst reactions of angry feminists, or to the imagined, inflamed, and even impersonated versions that have popped up over the last few years. After having been exposed to those judgments, or the imagined versions of them, people feel as if they've been told that they are evil or bad or whatever and must behave differently. And the response of young people, especially young men, when they think someone is trying to control them with what sounds like adversarial and made up bullshit, tends to be frustration and anger. This isn't just young people, and it's not just men, but it tends to be young men because there's a tendency among both young people and men to chaff at people attempting to control them. And yes, it tends to be young white men because white people are, on average, less used to people attempting to control them. And yes, it gets worse if the person attempting to do the controlling is a woman because, well, maybe let's not go there right now. And there's nothing like a person who's unused to feeling persecuted, and is maybe also feeling insecure and searching for a way to identify with strength and masculinity. And in the most severe cases, might even be feeling very lost and lonely and rejected for other reasons. For spending a lot of time getting really angry really publicly. So that's what I think it's about. And I think both sides participated handily in fucking it up. Because this was all supposed to be about empathy, and yet so many people's first exposure to these theories was being shouted at for being in the world incorrectly. And as much as young white men do not sound like the group of people that needs the most empathy in the world, I think there has been a lot of damage done to the world by belittling their frustrations and calling them unimportant. Even if those frustrations are comparatively unimportant, shouting, "Your frustrations are comparatively unimportant" at them is not how to make a better world. These are most certainly the words of someone who is a progressive, but these are not the words of someone who is an SJW. These aren't even the words of someone who is lost in an echo chamber. These are the words of a man who was aware of the damage that has been undeniably done by both sides of this issue and is lamenting the current situation in its entirety. If you take a second to read between the lines of this first paragraph, Hank is describing social justice ideologues refining themselves in their academic echo chambers. Then he goes on to express his own concern and frustration with the people vilifying young white men, who, from his perspective, aren't used to that kind of treatment, but I would argue that he also doesn't perceive them to be deserving of this treatment either. And this whole thing culminates with Hank saying, "As much as young white men do not sound like the group of people that needs the most empathy in the world, I think there has been a lot of damage done to the world by belittling their frustrations and calling them unimportant." Now, I didn't know this existed until just a few days ago, but does this or does this not almost perfectly match my characterization of Hank Green based on his actions at VidCon this summer? They were not specifically interested in punishing either individual for the event. Instead, their concern was coming to a peaceful resolution to the situation itself, so that VidCon could continue without further incident. Now, what this tells me is that VidCon staff were intent on acting as mediators for both the group of anti-SJW YouTubers and for Anita Sarkeesian herself. I would wager that following this event, VidCon staff likely sat Anita down and reprimanded her for her actions. In fact, in the statement VidCon released, this is exactly what they confirm. So given how both sides of the situation likely played out, Sargon having responded to this whole thing with a petition seeking retribution against Anita was foolish. Now, the point of this isn't for me to sit on some high horse and say I told you so. I've been noticing that people have been presuming a lot of things about people in advance, and this is something that leads to unnecessary conflict and strained relations where there didn't need to be any. We all need to recognize that just as we all have biases, we all assume things about people without actually knowing or even taking the time to see what kind of person someone actually is. This is something we don't only do for people we disagree with, or whose opinions we dislike, but also for people on our side, and in our own circles. And I'm not just talking about within the skeptic community. I mean, we all do this in our normal everyday lives. Now, I am only drawing conclusions based on all of the evidence on Hank Green that I have, so there is still every possibility that I could be wrong about the man's character. Hell, tomorrow, the tiny bit I know and have said about the man can be proven to be completely wrong in a single instant. The only thing I know is that based on what I've seen right now, I have no reason to doubt the conclusions I've come to at the moment, and I don't think other people have any reason to believe that he is someone who has acted or will act in bad faith. And again, this is the entire point of this video and the last video I did about this situation. I believe that we should see people as objectively as we possibly can. This means not assuming things when you can help it, and not ignoring things based on how you personally feel about someone. This is just a basic principle of mine that I hope other people will adopt as well. The way I see it, if we do not have the ability to objectively handle situations, instead of subjectively applying motivations and actions to people who we have no evidence to suggest accurately reflects who they are, then what makes us better than the SJWs? What makes us any different from people who hear MRA or conservative and immediately assume that the person is a racist, sexist, misogynist, without actually knowing what that person believes, what that person has done with their life, or who that person actually is? Everyone likes to throw out this Nietzsche quote: "If thou gaze long into an abyss, the abyss will also gaze into thee," just as I'm saying it now. These words should never be used as an implicit attack on the character of another person. They should only ever be used as a basis for each and every one of us to do just a little bit of self-reflection.